everyone, and thank you very much for joining me for another Let's Talk Health and Wellbeing discussion. Today I am joined by Joanne Tait, who is from our School of Engineering, as well as Jo Robertson from the School of Pharmacy and Life Sciences. And today we're going to be discussing women in STEM, what it's like to work in the STEM field, or even what it's like for women to have a career nowadays. Things have changed quite a bit from when women started off with their careers and how we're going to fit it, where we're looking at careers now. So I'm going to start off with asking yourself, Jo, what's your initial thoughts when you hear women in STEM?
My initial thoughts would be someone who's incredibly capable and a role model.
I like that one. That was beautiful. And yourself, Joanne?
I would echo that. I think that's a fairly good summation there. I think women in STEM, when you hear that as a term, people have immediate thoughts of strong women who are outgoing and doing all the ambassadorial work. So I think there's an element for me of extra burden that were just in the background. So I think that's one thing that sort of springs to mind when I hear the terms women in STEM.
I think when I hear women in STEM, I automatically start thinking of like the Big Bang Theory, kind of. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but you have Amy and like Bernadette, like they're very kind of scientific, they're very kind of straight to the business kind of thing. You normally see in TV shows and in movies that the women in STEM kind of fields they have like this sort of image painted around them, which isn't really actually the reality of it. But I just kind of wanted to kind of delve a bit more deeper into working within, so STEM projects can still be seen as mainly a man's industry, with it's like slowly growing to become more female led, but there is still quite primarily with men. So for example, Joanne, you work in the School of Engineering, and I know you mentioned in our previous when we were just chatting earlier, that you do have quite a fair few female in there, but it's not quite like a 50-50 split. But how does it feel for yourself walking in and going with into a room full of mainly men engineering? Is there a form of discomfort there, or is it quite is it very natural?
I think now, because I'm a strategic lead in the school, it's slightly different, I think, to when I was in my earlier career, if you will, in the lecturer and senior lecturer roles. I feel like walking in to a meeting now with my colleagues, I feel a lot more comfortable because we know each other, and we've established our relationships and our rapports. It's largely friendly, and even if we've got some heavy stuff to discuss, there's a mutual respect there. So I think nowadays that's fine, and I don't feel so anxious. But certainly in my earlier career, walking in, and they're termed manels now, or the panel with all men, I did feel as very self-conscious about what I was wearing or how I looked or how I comported myself, and often what I said in the meeting would be couched in a sorry to interject sort of thing, and very kind of submissive role, or that's what I felt anyway. I'm not entirely sure whether my male colleagues would agree, whether that's how it came across or not, I don't know. I think if you're a woman walking into something that is predominantly male, there is still an anxiousness, even if there's nothing to really worry about. There's a little bit of on the edge feeling there for, I would imagine, for most women, but I could entirely be wrong on that one.
One of the things you said there about the words that you say, for example, apologizing. I read an article where women are more likely to say, "Does that make sense?" After they explain something, they go, "Does that make sense?" Whereas men don't do that. Men will be, and again, I don't mean this to come across at all sexist or stereotyping or anything like this, but as soon as I read that, I'm like, I do that all the time. I write in my emails after explaining something, "Does that make sense?" And I'm trying to stop myself from doing it now, because it does come across as being submissive, and it kind of takes away from takes away from what you're saying, and it kind of gives the power over to the other person. And it should be a power play, but when you're the one who's in the control of something, it should be in your power. But I think it's quite interesting how something as simple as "does that make sense?" or "I'm sorry" can change the whole dynamic of a conversation. Now, Jo, I know you said about going into an external kind of meetings, and was it Manals you said, Joanne, like the term? How's that experience for yourself?
Well, I'm quite lucky, as I was saying earlier. I'm in a predominantly female department, and biology is always seen as the more female subject from the STEM subjects. But I have experienced being in meetings where it's predominantly a male with external settings that can be intimidating. But I also think that it's intimidating in general when you're trying to show that you're capable in STEM, because there's a lot of people who have very high level of qualifications. So a lot of professors or doctors, and that adds a level of, you feel on edge. So take into consideration the fact that you might be the individual from a different gender in the room. You can see how that can really make it difficult to be confident in what you're saying. I think it must be interesting as well if you go into biology as a male to understand whether they feel that. Certainly in our department, when the students come, there tends to be more females than males, and that would be nice to get more of a 50-50 split.
No, we've kind of said the 50-50 split a few times. Now this is, I realize, going slightly off topic. This might happen throughout this discussion. But I'm one of these people, I'm a bit kind of against the 50-50 split a little bit. I kind of feel like it should be the right person for the right job, or I don't think you should be forcing people into an area that they don't have much of an interest in. Would you want to see more of a 50-50 split in the industries, or do you think it should just be a case of, if you're interested in the industry, come along, join in? What's your thoughts on that? Whoever wants to answer it. Olivia's.
I'll leap in there. I'm not too worried about the actual split itself as a target, but if you consider the number of kids in a nursery, for example, who will already be given gendered toys, who will be praised for some behaviours over others, say nurturing over building, right from day one of birth, whether you like it or not. So at some point one has to put your child into a nursery, they're going to experience the thoughts of others. A brief example would be my, at the time, 2-3-year-old boy was playing with a pink Hoover in John Lewis, where a random lady just came up and told him that he shouldn't play with that because that's a girl's toy. So if you imagine, people just feel free to just spread their opinions everywhere, and that impacts on every child what their role is, what they're good at or not good at, or what they may tend to be not good at. As example, my daughter, who's 7, for some reason thinks she's bad at maths. And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. Let's have a look at that. So I set her some math challenges. Just looked at what she was getting at school, and I thought, well, I'll try that, and I'll up the ante just to see, what's the problem here. And I worked through them with her, and she got pretty much all of them right, beyond her expected abilities at the time. But still, she perceives that she's not good at maths because she didn't learn it in the same way as it was being taught to the boys. So they're mild examples, and I'm there to correct them and help her with that. But if you imagine all of that sweeping through all of the kids and the school kids and the people who are applying for degrees, that skew, it's not so much about who's right for the job, it's about who's been told they're right from that job right from the start. So I think if we were able to correct some of that, or adjust it, or make these things a little bit more open and even, you would find that there is an increase. It may not be to 50-50, and I don't think that necessarily is a goal, but I think you would find that there's suddenly a lot more women at the table, certainly for engineering, which is a problem-solving degree. If you talk about engineering as problem-solving, it is looking at the world and making the world better. And who better than for primarily half the world as women to do that job is making things better. It includes multitasking and a whole host of other skills to look at something and think, how could I make this better? And so to think that only 80 to 90% of the engineers who are men can only do that, I don't think that's correct. I think there should be a bigger shift there. And I'm about to say it. I'm going to stop myself, but I nearly said, does that make sense?
Yeah.
I nearly did it, and I just did it. So
I was just going to add on there, Joanne, I completely agree. I found when I was at school, I used to think I wasn't good at maths as a child, and I would be interested to see if there is a societal change, how that affects the number of students going into the courses. Would that mean more men joining biology courses and more women joining engineering or maths? And I think something that I struggled with throughout school and as an adult is STEM communication, which would be far more improved if we had genders more equal, whether that be 50-50 or not. So I used to think being a scientist was you wear the white coat, you're in a room and you just do your experiments and you don't speak to people. But in reality, there's so much more. You have to collaborate, and the best type of science is through creativity and working with others. And if you don't have an equal split, or as much or more equal split as we can, how can you communicate ideas to both genders in the same way? How can the STEM communication be improved if really only one or predominantly one gender is coming up with that idea? You would then always feel it wasn't an even split. Keep saying equal. Maybe I need to learn another word that I can use to
equitable split.
Equitable, yeah, in this situation. So yeah, I've always felt that STEM communication is something that would be improved by being more involved with different areas. I don't know anything about engineering and would probably really enjoy elements of it, but throughout how I was taught at school, felt like that wasn't an opportunity available to me.
I think it's a real shame, because what I've found is that when I talk to women in their sort of mid to late 20s, I really want to do this now, but I didn't realize at the time, so I never took maths to the level, or I didn't focus as much on that, because at the moment in engineering, maths is still seen as like the benchmark. You must be good at it. Actually, and I know it's anathema to most of my colleagues, but you don't actually have to be brilliant at it. You have to work at it, but there's ways around that, and it's not the be all and end all. What worries me about, particularly in the engineering industry, if they don't change the course we're currently at. So for the past 30-40 years, we've been at about an 80-20 split, thereabouts. It hasn't really changed a huge amount. Lots more women who are engineers are more vocal. There's a pile of work being done, but fewer women are taking maths at the level at school that we need. So they can't get in. So there's some wider problems there. But the bigger problem to me is that if only one sex is actually designing the problem solution, or the solution to the problem, if you will, they are going to miss out a number of elements. For example, classic examples, the seat belt is designed for a male torso, not a female torso. So women are more at danger than men when driving the car. There are countless examples of lack of inclusivity that would not necessarily be completely solved, but by having more a more diverse group of engineers, fewer of these problems, I think, would arise. So I think it is a really important thing to address. Whether we can all address it by ourselves or whether it will take 50 years or maybe more, I'm not quite sure. But we do need that that increase in diversity.
I wonder if something I've often thought, going back to the idea of communication and what you've just said as well, Joanne, is breaking down how they're segregated. So for instance, a lot of work now is, there's biomedical engineering where biology and engineering are coming together, and not just in that example. There's lots of other areas of STEM where maybe the traditional segregation of subjects is preventing the diversity, because people are automatically in school cutting themselves off from deciding what to go in. Whereas if it was more of a fluid idea that, well, it's not necessarily the case that if you're good at physics and maths that you would be right, you're going straight into engineering. There's other crossovers that would allow you to have the different subject areas. And also there's not enough, I feel, and certainly when I was at school, information on what the subjects actually are. So the children are picking blind. When you're at school, you have to pick these subjects that are going to determine what you can do at university, but you don't know what the courses are at university yet. And that, of course, then is going to make you, whether that be a female who thinks she's not good at maths, think, well, I'm not going to take physics because I'm not good at maths. And that, without her realizing, then means when she comes to 5th year, oh, I actually can't do engineering because I don't have the subjects I need to get in.
That's it. Yeah. Heather, you were going to say something before I butted in.
Sorry, I always find it really strange. Now, I realize it's kind of going slightly off topic, but picking your subjects in the academy, like you're 12, 13 years old. How can you pick the subjects that's going to determine your whole career and your life? Like, I think that's just insane. Now, for myself, like I did school a bit backwards. Like when I left school, I went straight into work. And I actually started building a career in the hospitality industry. And I was maybe about 22 when I decided that what I actually wanted to do with my life. And then I actually did I did the 2+2 years. So I did 2 years at college and then 2 years at university. And I actually think I was better off for it, because I actually found with my university years, I studied a lot harder and I was a lot more kind of invested in my education. Whereas I think if I went into university at 18, 19, Freshers Week would have probably hit me a bit too hard. But I just think it's insane that my oldest niece has just currently picked all her subjects, and I'm like, she's just turned 14. How can she possibly know what subject she's going to need for the rest of her life? And again, it sounds a bit dramatic, but that is what it is. But we're going to come away.
Right. I was asked to choose. So back in the day when I was at school, and I was very arty at the time. I wanted to do art, drama and music. I wasn't really interested in anything scientific at the time, although I had a sideline in weird things I'd found on the farm, which turned out to be biology. it seemed to be, and I couldn't do that. You had to pick a spread, and so I actually wasn't able to specialize when I knew that's what I wanted to do. When it came to hires, I actually failed all my hires first time round, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was not in a mental space to complete these exams. Still not great at exams, actually. I went to college a bit, and I decided, I think it was social science at the time, and it just was not for me. Worked in cafes, bars, did gigs. Then I discovered that geology was an actual thing, because I'd always collected rocks and really loved looking at them, and discovered you can actually study these and people will pay you money to know what rocks are. So in order to do that, I had to do evening classes to get the right qualifications to get into first year. But I luckily was able to do a lot more of them and go into second year of geology. And so that path was really quite windy, but I think it was actually good for me to have that. And if we don't have these access routes, it's something I think is really important. These access routes in from wherever are key to bringing in a diverse group of, say, engineers or pharmacists or chemists or life scientists. It's those routes in. So I think almost the hires, and this is maybe a bold statement, are becoming a hindrance to people's access to further education.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that I think recently they said they're looking for more doctors, but they don't have enough students who'd made the requirements. And then this year, from everything that happened with COVID, I think they were getting a record number of them with the grades.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. And now it's all grade inflation. And I'm thinking, no, maybe they had more time to focus because they weren't out playing or whatever you do as teenagers now. They're probably not out playing. Maybe they had more focus time. Maybe they worked harder. Maybe they just pulled out the stops. And, you know, this idea of grade inflation, I think, is not helpful at all.
Yeah, I agree. I think as well, I mean, so often you go to the doctor and they potentially might be very clever, very smart individual, but they might not be good at dealing with people. And so someone might not have made the grades, but they are fantastic with people. So
exactly.
I think that there has to be a balance, because you need someone who will listen to the patients and say, right, I know where you're coming from.
Absolutely.
Well, we've come completely off topic and now gone on to the like gender equality within children and directing them into their careers. So what I'm going to try and do is we're going to try and bring it back to women in the workplace kind of conversation. I think we could actually speak about like genderizing toys and going to school as a whole topic on its own. And I think it's actually quite an interesting topic. I think because I have nieces and nephews who are going through that system right now, it's very kind of fresh in my mind to see it. Obviously, Joanne, you've got your kids as well. I'm not sure if Joe, if you have any children in your life, like nieces and nephews and all that you can see, but it's scary that what they're going through. But I'm going to bring it back to almost kind of the culture within women in the workplace, like women in STEMs. So like we'll start with like motherhood. I think motherhood and the potential of becoming a parent while working in like very career driven industries such as both of your kind of careers and how that impacts now. Joanne, you have kids yourself. How do you find I say work-life balance, but work-life parent balance? I can imagine that would have been very impacted by COVID and the fact that your children were all home from school during the first, we'll say pretty much the last year, pretty much.
Yeah, that wasn't easy, and that would probably take another hour just to release all of that tension. In terms of parenthood and career, I have to say, for the most part, I've been fairly lucky in that our School of Engineering works fairly flexibly for mums and dads of kids. Or pets perhaps as well. Also, there's a bit of flexibility there, where if we've done are able to complete our tasks for that week, apologies, my email keeps pinging anyway, if we've completed our tasks or if we're able to work around our commitments, we're pretty much permitted to do so, which is great, but there's a little bit of a poison chalice in that we attempt to try and do more to make up for that extra flexibility. When I first went on maternity, for the first time, I took 7 months off and then phased return because I was scared to fall behind with my projects and the things I was working on, because they were left essentially they're not other people's priorities. So I felt that quite keenly the first time round and attempted to work even harder to make up for that. I'm not entirely sure it was expected explicitly or even implicitly, but I did it anyway because I felt like I ought to do that. I ought to work harder. I ought to ensure that I did more than other people to make up for the fact that I had this extra being in my life, which, as I say it now, sounds really quite silly, but it wasn't. It was a real feeling. I've got this extra, it's a shame to say, a burden or a commitment in my life, which might detract from my day-to-day job. So if he's ill, I've got to deal with that. That has to happen. Obviously, you can't just leave them. You have to deal with that. But it meant missing a meeting that was key, or you felt that you were letting your colleagues down, or that you weren't performing as well as other people. I think, certainly for me, I put that all on myself. I'm not entirely sure if I asked my colleagues or I got someone else to ask them whether they actually thought that's what was happening, whether I was letting anyone else down or everyone else just realized this is part of normal life and accepted it. The second time around, my daughter, a couple of years later, I took more time off, but I was lucky in that I timed it so that when I came back, it was a good time to come back in the academic year. That wasn't actually planned that way. I'm not that bad, but it was a happy coincidence. But again, a lot of my projects and my work and my scholarly work and research was just left. It wasn't picked up because there wasn't really that capability for anyone to pick it up. They have their own work to do. So I'm explaining this badly, I think, but the challenge with the parenthood is that when you leave your work for a period of time, the chances are it's going to stay static or stagnant or forgotten until you return and pick it up again. And there's a pressure to that. There's a pressure to return. When you are back from your parental leave, you then are balancing all of these things at the same time. And I have to say the guilt that goes along with that is quite immense. I suspect, probably uncharitably, that women do feel that a bit more. I'm not suggesting that men don't feel it at all, but I do think that it's probably weighted in our favour on the guilt front. But I think for the most part, that balance is very challenging. It's not easy for anybody, but I think particularly in where there is a gender imbalance, such as engineering, I think it does make that a little bit worse. It exacerbates that feeling.
I think one of the interesting things with the work week and parents is so the work week, when it was originally designed, it was designed on the basis that the man would be a full-time work and the woman will be full-time stay-at-home mom, and that was how it was all kind of made. And then obviously women became wanted careers, they wanted to build up and have something of their own, but the home life dynamic has never actually really changed. So now, like parenthood itself, I see, although I don't have any children myself, I know quite a few people who have kids, and parenthood itself is almost like a full-time job. I think someone described that having a child is actually like having 2.5 jobs in total, because it is round the clock kind of care that you're giving. Like obviously, if you have a child, it's round the clock care 24/7. And I think it's quite interesting that we're now in a place where both men and women are expected to work X amount of hours if they want to kind of have build a career or develop, have a job, as well as having the childcare. But again, this is nothing against men. This may come across as a slightly sexist point of view. I don't mean it to, but primarily what happens if your child's ill, it's mom that gets called to come home. Or I think there was this comic book strip that you take your kids to the park and your kid's screaming and it's all that mom's not looking after the kid. But if it's dad at the park with the kids, like, oh, can I help you? And it's dad's babysitting the kids. It's your children. You're not babysitting your own children. And it's like that weird kind of dynamic going on. Now, I know, Jo, you yourself, you don't have any children, But like, do you have a point of view on like parenthood within the workplace, or do you think that they like what how do you find the dynamics of that kind of area?
Well, I agree from what I see with Joanne, but obviously I can't give an opinion on that without, I'm not a mother. But I think it's interesting to bring my perspective from a technical role. It's a very physically demanding job. And so I can imagine that the physical exhaustion, if you're a mother, as well as the mental exhaustion, if you're a technician who is of a mother, it must be very difficult. Something that I've thought would potentially be almost impossible to overcome is flexible working, in the sense of, if you've got an experiment that's running, well, you have to be in the building. And if things need set up for students, well, you can't really do that at home. There's a lot of things that I can do within my role at home, a lot of the procurement and admin and things that I'm sure if you are a mother, you could work that around. But ultimately, you need to be on campus more than in a academic role, unless, if you're undergoing research, and of course when they're actually on campus for teaching and things. It just would be something that has to be considered, and I've thought about in terms of colleagues or people that I know in different institutions, how much that physical struggle can add on.
See, I find RG, I think I've been with RG for 2.5 years, and I find that they're actually really supportive with the flexible roles and the flexible working. I've got 2 mums in my office, and you never know what's going to happen with the kids. You never know when one of them's going to get poorly, or one of them's getting sent home for hurting themselves at school. So I think it's very well done, like how flexible RGU is with
yes,
parents.
I think RGU is very flexible.
We're not just saying this because we work for RG, guys. We want to clarify that.
No, it is actually very flexible. I'd say that, and that certainly, as I said before, like in engineering, that flexibility is extended to male colleagues also. And I think I've seen quite a bit, certainly over the past few years, of male colleagues having a lot more of that caring role, more of a role in the school pickups and drop-offs, and they got to go home for this, so they've got an appointment. See a lot more of that nowadays than you did, say, maybe 10 years ago, where it would really be the mum going and doing all of the things. The past a couple of years ago, my husband got laid off in the downturn, and so he was at home for a year or so, and so for a few months, they did phone, the school would phone me first. And I'm like, my husband is literally 5 minutes walk from you. Why are you phoning me? But eventually they got around to that. And he did all of that caring. So I think there are some inroads being made on that front. But from a flexibility point of view, it is, I would say it's a really flexible employer. And the things that they have in place to support that flexibility do appear to work. They certainly have worked for me. I don't think I'd be able to achieve half the things that I'd achieved if they said, no, you must work 9 to 5 and have an hour for lunch. That model cannot work for me. So I've been allowed to work in different ways over the past few years, be it part-time, full-time, weird hours, all of that, and it's been really accommodating. And that's allowed me probably to work harder than I would have if they'd made me stick to something more rigid. So I do think that is a positive, and I hope that other universities also do this. But
yeah, I think even for general thing like tasks, or it's much more accepted in RGU, I feel, I've got to work around this time. Or I think during COVID that kind of changed a lot of it, because all of it had to be done online, and it was really useful for me as well, because actually I could do the admin stuff at home much more effectively because I was able to focus on it, because I wasn't having to think about the lab. But I think that there is something in STEM that is underlying issue with flexibility, and that is if you're doing lab work, you do not have a lab at home. And there's kind of no way around that. Unless you build a lab. I mean, that would be great.
We could put
Pretty
that
cool
in.
having your own lab built at home.
Yeah, ideal.
But then we do have certain companies that, so like, as we said, RG, it's great for flexibility, but you have like certain companies where they're not overly flexible for working parents. I read that like auditing, in the financial auditing, it starts off as quite a fairly balanced structure with half women, half men. But as you kind of get through it and the women start to start families, the drop-off rate for women in auditing is quite high, because it doesn't actually really support working parents. And I think society as a whole, I think women are just as bad for this as anyone else, but we still kind of put on the role of, oh, mum's going to do that, or mum's like, we still kind of put the pressure on mum. And we haven't quite gotten out that balance of, you know, you've got two working parents, so you've got two full-time parents at the same time, so it shouldn't be a case of mum, it's the case of parents. But I know I'm quite bad for it. Like I always say to like my sisters, like I always presume that they're the ones that are going to be doing the school pickup, not their partners. And I think there needs to be some form of like kind of switch there, where it is more on parents rather than the mums. And I do think, speaking for myself, I'm still quite bad for presuming that mom's going to do everything, rather than it being a working family unit where dad has an involvement and is actually going to do stuff there. Do you think that switch is possible? Do you think it's something that we can see happening? Don't know who else to jump in that one.
I think this is a UK thing a lot of the time. I think in some of the nearby countries, shall we say, have a lot more balance on that front. Particularly Nordic countries seem to have way more balance. They have later school starts. There's just an expectation that family comes first, and that's expected from everybody. And that seems like a very ideal rose-tinted glasses. I'm sure that it's not all like that, but the impression that I get is that this everything on mum thing is definitely still a UK centric view. And because we're here, and that's how it is, and we have to deal with it. But we could have a look at how other countries operate in this area. I think we would be well served to look at that, and just to look beyond our own expectations and think, well, how differently could this be? But that takes a huge amount of effort and desire from all facets of society to make those changes. It's all very well for me to say, that's it, we're, my family's pretty much well evenly balanced with the care, so everyone else should be. And it doesn't really work like that. I think it takes a whole unit or a whole enterprise to go, this is how we're going to do our business now and move forward. But that really depends on the appetite of everybody.
I would agree. Definitely a UK thing. My sister lives in Sweden, and she's already told me about some of the differences there. She doesn't have children, but actually made a decision to move to a country which would be more facilitating and having children when she wants to do so. But I also think a lot of it is social pressures we put on ourselves. I can't talk from motherhood, but certainly a lot of the pressures that I have are what I put on myself. And certainly as women, from my friends who I speak to about it, it seems to be more prevalent in women that we put this pressure on ourselves to always get things right, to always succeed, and to prove ourselves.
Why do you think that is? Because this happens in the workplace as well. We, like, as we said earlier, that we take on all these extra job roles and we take on all these extra tasks. Why do you think we as women have this urge to try and prove ourselves by taking on all these tasks and putting it on ourselves? Whoever wants it.
I don't know. I really don't know.
It's that timeless question, is it, why do we do this?
Why do we do this to ourselves? Well, an example could be, if you look at Hollywood, we bring in Hollywood because if we're going to do off-topic things, sometimes it's good. We bring in people who were in the past perceived to be difficult women, who were divas, who were awkward, who demanding. And then you find out 20 or so years later that what they failed to do was accommodate a man in some way, and that was then blacklisted for the rest of their time. They didn't get those big jobs anymore because they'd asked for equal pay, or they'd asked to not be harassed, or all of those things. And it sounds quite glib to just compare Hollywood to academia, obviously slightly different. But I think certainly in my experience, I've seen women who've been outspoken or challenging or difficult, and they are sort of ignored or chastised or put aside. So for me personally, being difficult is hard because I'm worried that I then will be seen as less than or sidelined, or, you know, not perhaps seen as, you know, for promotion or as capable, because I've then said, no, I will not do that thing. It takes a great deal, and I do it because you have to, but it takes me a lot to say, no, I cannot do this thing, find someone else. A lot more than I suspect that many of my colleagues would have, wouldn't lose much sleep over, if you will, whereas I'll say, no, I can't do that thing, and I'll worry about it for 2 days. And yeah, I'm not suggesting that's a good model. You shouldn't do that. But I think I've seen that before in the past of women who I might have seen as role models who suddenly were in the bad books because they didn't do what was expected. And so for me personally, that's where that comes from, that yes, of course I'll do that to the best, and worry about it and make sure that it's perfect for everybody. That's where that comes from. I think we're really kind of straying into psychology here. We could probably do with some professionals. That's it for me. I don't know what it's like for you two. You're a lot younger.
I'm the same. I really struggle to say no. I really, really struggle. And because I have social anxiety, I find that very difficult because I don't like confrontation, and I find it hard to say no. So when you do worry about it, and you worry, is that person going to think differently of me now? Do they think that I'm not capable of doing that? Is this going to affect how I'm seen for promotion, like you say? So it's good to know I'm not alone in that. And I think that probably a lot of women probably feel that way, but we just don't talk about it. I don't know. I mean, if we've got a focus group, I'm sure we'd find out more, but I can only speak from my experience.
So I'm going to try and link all this conversation together. So we've just spoken about a lot of like women in careers, women in STEM, and the development there, but the whole conversation is around health and well-being. So I'm going to look at the health and well-being of working in the STEM industry as a woman. So Jo, you've mentioned social anxiety. We've mentioned things about going into for life, I can't remember the term you used, Joanne, but a manel. And having that kind of like, I have that. I'm not from in a STEM, but going into a room full of men and thinking, right, okay, am I dressed appropriately enough for this? Do I 100% know what? And I start developing these little social, these little anxiety kind of things within me. And I start kind of getting really paranoid that I don't actually know what I'm talking about when I 100% know what I'm talking about. I start doubting myself. And that's when that phrase comes in, is, does that make sense? So we're going to have a wee kind of focus around the health and well-being of women who work in the STEM fields, or just career working women in general. Is there a way that we can overcome this? Like, do you both find it to be a big issue having these kind of health impacts in your industry?
I'm happy to jump in on this one. I think one of the main ways of overcoming it, and part of why I've taken part in this talk today, is talking about it. For me, if I talk about it, I feel like there's a weight being lifted off my shoulders. And the problem we have at the minute is that talking about it is seen as a weakness or a stigma, whether people want to admit it or not. You know, you'll talk to someone about it and they then pity you and you worry, does that change their opinion of me? So you hold it in and then you feel worse. And really what needs to happen is these discussions need to happen more regularly. And people then need to be able to feel like it's okay and to say, I was feeling really anxious about this, or I really struggle with having depression, or I really struggle with anxiety, or but it not to change how people perceive your work. And I think that for me as a young woman in STEM in the early stages of my career, I'm trying to make sure that I'm seen as someone who is hardworking and can go far, because that's what I am. But I have an issue discussing how I really feel. And I think it's important that I speak up and say that to allow other people to say that and feel better too, and overall make a better environment for everybody to work in.
That's really, it's good that you are open, I feel, because I think without it, we'll just carry on. And I think in terms of well-being is different to a health issue. So there's just to bring up the topic of burnout. Burnout is real across all spectrum of people. It's not just women. It's not just women with anxiety. Burnout is a real thing, and I think without discussing these things and how people are feeling more openly, that burnout will just continue. And so yes, being more open is helpful. I'm reasonably open about my mental health issues, or in the past anyway, with my colleagues, so that if they are feeling the same way, they have somebody who has already done it, so they don't feel like they have to be that first person to say, actually, that's why I was off, type thing. We try to make it more open. My PhD is in mental well-being of engineering students, but that encompasses engineers and the way engineers work and the way they solve problems. And by doing that work, I'm hopefully opening some doors there to have people feel more open to discuss these things, so that burnout, if it is going to occur, is perhaps shorter lived or even prevented if we can. I think I don't know if it is particularly STEM, potentially. There maybe is. There's just that additional pressure there to be scientists and engineers and mathematicians, and that we feel that we cannot show weakness and we must be objective at all times. But we occupy human bodies, and human bodies are are human. They're not robots. We have to continue. I do see that in my engineering colleagues often, is that if it's not something that they can solve objectively, it becomes a thing that is either will grow and become more problematic because they've ignored it, or they consider it a soft thing that's not for them. So I think there's a lot of work to do around well-being. I think we're making good inroads with it. I certainly RGU have done a lot of work in that respect, but I think perhaps there's some more work to be done.
I definitely agree. I think there's definitely a lot more work that could be done around well-being and mental health. This is one of the reasons why we started these conversations, is because we want them to be more talked about. I still find that there's a bit around almost like kind of people. I feel some people might feel a bit shameful admitting to having a mental health condition, and I think that's something that shouldn't be happening. So it's when people bring it up and they're kind of like, oh, should I really mention it? Should I really talk about it? So for example, the lockdown over Christmas, the January lockdown, I actually really struggled with that one. And I felt like admitting that I was struggling with it was almost a case of I was admitting defeat kind of thing, or I was admitting that I couldn't cope with something, and it's no, it's not that. It was a case, it was a difficult time, like Christmas, New Year's, it's meant to be a time with your family and your friends, and we didn't get that, and we've spent a whole year in lockdown. So I do think these conversations should be more widely open, and I think it'd be quite interesting for yourselves, because, and again, this is me stereotyping the male gender, is that males are typically more closed off than women are, and women are more inclined, will probably more inclined to share their feelings and their opinions. But when you are a woman who works primarily with men, and then you think, can I really share my opinion with the men? Are they going to start seeing me as this weaker sex or this weaker person? And it does it. I think like that in itself would impact your whole thought process when trying to discuss your mental health well-being. Now, Joanne, you've mentioned that you were doing your PhD was with student well-being within students in engineering. Has there anything interesting come out from that study that you've been doing? Like, is there any kind of things that really kind of you want to highlight?
Yeah, definitely. I'm still early. I've got all my results. I'm working through them, but I did a research project with students from a number of different universities and colleagues as well, around trying to build a support system or something for engineering students who particularly don't seek help until it is way too late in the game. So if they came a bit earlier, people would be able to help them a bit more quickly. They would get less ill, they might not get ill at all, that kind of thing. And what I discovered is that really, through the way that we teach engineering, we are teaching them to self-solve every problem. You solve that problem yourself. And I'm talking about engineering problems at this stage, but that gets translated over into how they will seek help themselves. So instead of saying, I'm going to phone and get counselling, for example, which might be an option, say I'm really struggling, I want to speak to a counsellor, they won't do that. They'll either hold off on that, they might try and do something themselves first, they might, for the most part, just ignore it. But the desire when they wanted to go and get some help was to solve that problem themselves without actually speaking to anyone. which is interesting, because what we offer as universities, not just our one, is a counselling service of 6 blocks, block 6. That's what you get. I think it's about 6 hours, maybe once a week, and that's the support that you get, which is great for lots of people. But for engineers, they don't want 6 weeks block. That's a commitment of time that they don't have. They're just going to get more behind with coursework if they do that. So they don't go when they probably should. So what I'm finding is that we need to build a process that engineering students, and probably computing students as well, it's a similar problem solving process that they go through, to support them supporting themselves through that well-being journey. So am I anxious because I have a deadline today? Or am I anxious because I have an anxiety disorder that requires further support through CBT or through medication or both? Or am I just stressed because I let all my coursework bunch up, and actually help them work their way through that? So what I've discovered is that really we need to trial these things. We're going to trial that hopefully in semester 1. But there is a different approach to their own well-being. It is very crunch orientated, deadlines, just work harder, I'll just work all night, that's fine. It's not fine, no one should be working all night. We plan things so that you don't, but for some reason that's how it ends up. So a lot of the well-being, there's a cultural element where I think the students think it's implied that they should work like that. In no way does any of our documentation or any lecturers say that. So we've got to unpick some of that as well. So there's a cultural element, but there's also the way we are training our students how to solve problems and how that's being translated into trying to solve emotional problems.
I think it's quite interesting how you brought up the peer-to-peer stuff. I actually spoke to an academic from one of the other schools, who recently did a project called Unearthing Farming. I don't know if either of you have heard it, but it's all about peer-to-peer support in farmers, and how much that actually helps within the farming community, because they are seen as quite isolated. And so it's interesting that you're now bringing this in with engineering. I think peer-to-peer support is the way forward, because you're not speaking to someone who is like 30 years senior to you, who had different experiences, because things were different 30 years ago to what they are now. Like, I think today's youth have got so much more things going on, and like even the crosses between like Gen Z and the millennials, it's so different, and it's I think that's quite important. I think peer-to-peer is the way forward. I was when I was in the academy, I was a peer listener in my 5th year, and even like that school stage, like that was brought in, and even speaking to some of the 3rd years, like as they're going through the first exams, like it was I like to think it was very beneficial, but I was one of the peer listeners, so I'm hoping I actually did help someone at one point. But we are going to bring the discussion to an end, and I'm going to ask for your final thoughts on both women in STEM, as well as what you can see as the future of health and well-being within your industry. So I'm going to start off with yourself, Jo, and what your final thoughts are, and what you think are the next step for health and well-being in your industry.
Well, I think my final thoughts are that the fact that we're having this discussion means that change is already happening. And it's important to look at the positive effects and be aware of what needs to change, but also accept that, yes, there's only so much we might be able to do, but if we have discussions and are compassionate individuals with people, peers and students, that will make a change. And even a small change, like taking a student aside if you think that they're struggling and asking them if they're okay, can make the world of difference. Lead into the health and well-being change that in the past you were thought of as, I certainly as a student all the way through school, and then in lectures, it was very much a transmissive approach. That has changed in the past few years. And I think when I was at university, I was already seeing the change, and not just within university, but outside in industry, in STEM, and health and well-being in other sectors is being thought of as, we're not just going to talk to the students or the staff, people will be asked to be involved, and more of a student-centered or person-centered approach within the industry or the institution. And that will lend itself to people being able to prioritize health and well-being, because you're already asking the questions, which is really beneficial. But we can do more with initiatives to help people talk about it more, and research like what Joanne's doing and in her PhD, and to get students and staff the support that they need. And also just reshifting the focus, as how we were talking about Nordic countries, maybe we can reshift the focus. And I think COVID has actually played a big part in doing that, and making people realize, you might love your work, and I do, and that should be something that is a priority, but it is not the priority. Your health and well-being and your family should be your priority. And I think over the past year, that's being thought of as what is the way to go forward. I think that's brilliant, and hopefully there'll be more things to continue on to keep progressing that idea further.
Perfect. And yourself, Joanne?
That was really good. Can you remind me of the two? Sorry.
Sorry. So what you where you think the future of health and well-being within the STEM industries are, and what your final thoughts on women in STEM, and basically women in STEM, health and well-being, your final thoughts on it all.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. It's the last thing that's getting me now. So I feel that to further enhance the women in STEM trajectory, I think we need to be supporting each other openly, and trying not to compete with each other, to lift each other up. These small gestures in supporting our female colleagues go a long way, I think, to helping the experience of women in STEM, and to hopefully then encourage them to stay. It's not just about getting more women to get into STEM, it's about encouraging the ones who are already there to stay there and to do good while they're there. In terms of health and well-being, it's a similar story. We need to help each other. We need to be open and non-judgmental, and have that conversation out loud with other people in our community.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I think some of the final thoughts I've picked up from this is that we really do need to start talking about our health, kind of decrease the stigmatism around how we're feeling, and kind of make it less feeling shameful speaking about how we are feeling, how we are doing, and not having our generic answer of, oh, I'm fine, but really like opening up and be like, oh, I've struggled over the last few days, but I'm there now. I think these are important conversations to have, and it's important to see this movement happening, and I'm so glad that we are a part of it. But thank you so much for joining us today, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to you joining our next one. Thank you.